Imagine walking through a forest. The sun is setting, casting long shadows through the trees. But as you get closer, you realize these aren't trees at all. They're stakes, thousands of them. And impaled on each one is a human body, some still barely alive, their screams echoing through the valley. The smell is unbearable. Birds circle overhead, and standing in the middle of this nightmare, calmly eating his dinner, is one man. His name is Vlad the Impaler. And this forest of death? It was his message to the most powerful empire on earth. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're diving into one of the most brutal, shocking, and absolutely terrifying moments in medieval history. This is the story of how one man, ruling a small kingdom you've probably never heard of, turned the Ottoman Empire's invasion into their worst nightmare. Before we get into the bloodbath, let me set the scene for you, because you need to understand just how insane this situation was. It's the mid-1500s, and the Ottoman Empire is at the peak of its power. We're talking about an empire that stretched from the Middle East to the gates of Vienna, from North Africa to the Black Sea. They had one of the most advanced militaries in the world, with elite janissaries, massive artillery, and literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers at their command. They were unstoppable. Everyone knew it, and they had just conquered Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, basically ending 1,000 years of Roman history. So yeah, they were feeling pretty confident. Now, nestled right on their border was this tiny little principality called Wallachia. Today, it's part of Romania, but back then it was caught between two superpowers. To the south, you had the Ottomans, constantly demanding tribute and trying to expand their territory. To the north, you had the Kingdom of Hungary, also Christian, also trying to exert influence. And Wallachia, it was stuck in the middle, paying tribute to the Ottomans just to survive. Enter Vlad III, also known as Vlad Dracula, which literally means son of the dragon, because his father was part of this chivalric order called the Order of the Dragon. Now Vlad's childhood was absolutely brutal, and it shaped him into the monster he would become. When he was just a boy, maybe 11 or 12 years old, he and his younger brother were taken hostage by the Ottoman Sultan as insurance to keep their father loyal. Can you imagine that? Being handed over to your enemy as a human bargaining chip? Vlad spent years in Ottoman captivity, probably in the capital of Edirne, and he witnessed their culture, their military tactics, and most importantly, their methods of punishment. The Ottomans loved using impalement as a form of execution. It was public, it was horrifying, and it sent a very clear message. Vlad took notes. He learned everything he could, and he never forgot what they did to him and his family. His father was eventually assassinated by rival nobles backed by the Hungarians, and his older brother was captured, tortured, and buried alive. So when Vlad finally took the throne of Wallachia in 1456, he had revenge on his mind, and he had learned from the best when it came to brutality. Now Vlad's first order of business wasn't even the Ottomans, it was his own people. See, the nobility in Wallachia, called the boyars, were corrupt, backstabbing, and constantly plotting against the prince. These were the same families that had killed his father and brother. So what does Vlad do? He invites them all to a big Easter feast. Everyone's having a great time, eating, drinking, celebrating. And then Vlad's guards lock the doors. He arrests the older nobles, the ones who had directly betrayed his family, and he has them impaled right there in the courtyard. The younger, healthier nobles? He marches them 50 miles away and forces them to build him a castle, working them literally to death. This castle, Ponari Castle, still stands today on a cliff overlooking a river valley. It took months to build, and most of those nobles never made it home. This is how Vlad operated. He was methodical, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. And he was just getting started. Back to the Ottomans. Wallachia was technically a vassal state, which meant they had to pay an annual tribute to the Sultan. But they also had to send 500 young boys every year as part of the devshirme system. where these boys would be converted to Islam and trained as janissaries or government officials. Basically, the Ottomans were taking Wallachian children and turning them into Ottoman soldiers. Vlad absolutely hated this. He saw it as a betrayal of his faith, his people, and his sovereignty. So when the new Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, the same guy who conquered Constantinople, sent envoys to Wallachia to demand the tribute and the boys, Vlad decided he'd had enough. The story goes that when the Ottoman envoys arrived at his court, they refused to remove their turbans as a sign of respect, saying it was against their religious custom. Vlad, never one to back down, reportedly said something like, "Well, let me help you honor your custom," and then had their turbans nailed to their heads with iron spikes. He sent them back to Mehmed like that. A declaration of war without saying a single word. Now, you have to understand, this was suicide. Wallachia had maybe 30,000 soldiers at best. The Ottoman Empire could field armies 10 times that size. Mehmed II wasn't just any sultan. He was 23 years old, ambitious, and had just conquered the greatest city in the world. He was riding high on a wave of victories, and here's this little prince from a nothing kingdom basically spitting in his face. Mehmed was furious. He immediately began preparing an invasion force. But Vlad wasn't just going to sit there and wait to be crushed. No, he had a plan, and it was as brutal as it was brilliant. Vlad knew he couldn't win a conventional battle. His army was too small, his resources too limited. So he did what any smart underdog does. He went guerrilla. He started a campaign of total psychological warfare against the Ottomans. In the winter of 1461, Vlad crossed the Danube River, the border between Wallachia and Ottoman territory, with a small force of soldiers. And he went on an absolute rampage. He attacked Ottoman towns, villages, and military outposts along the southern bank of the Danube. But this wasn't just a military campaign, this was terrorism. Vlad didn't just defeat his enemies, he made examples of them. He would capture Ottoman soldiers and civilians, and he would impale them, hundreds at a time. He'd burn entire villages to the ground, leaving nothing but ash and bodies. He wanted to send a message not just to Mehmed, but to every single person in the Ottoman Empire. Don't mess with Wallachia. And the psychological impact was devastating. Imagine you're an Ottoman soldier stationed near the border, and you start hearing these stories. You hear about entire garrisons being wiped out, about women and children impaled on stakes, about this madman who drinks wine while watching his victims die. Fear spread like wildfire through the Ottoman ranks. Vlad even wrote a letter to the King of Hungary bragging about his kills. He claimed he'd killed over 23,000 Ottomans in this campaign alone. Whether that number is accurate or exaggerated, we'll never know, but the point is, Vlad wanted everyone to know what he was capable of. So Mehmed II, understandably enraged and maybe a little disturbed, decided it was time to end this once and for all. In the spring of 1462, he assembled a massive invasion force. We're talking about 60 to 90,000 soldiers, including elite janissaries, cavalry and artillery. Some historians say it was even larger, possibly over 100,000 men. For context, that's more than the population of most cities in Europe at the time. This was an overwhelming force, and Mehmed personally led the army, which shows you how seriously he took this. He marched north toward Wallachia, expecting to crush Vlad in a matter of weeks and install a puppet ruler. But Vlad wasn't done playing mind games. As the Ottoman army marched through Wallachia, they noticed something strange. The land was empty. No people, no animals, no food, nothing. Vlad had implemented a scorched-earth policy. He'd evacuated entire regions, burned crops, poisoned wells, and destroyed anything the Ottoman army could use. The Ottomans were marching through a wasteland, and their supply lines were being harassed constantly by Wallachian guerrilla fighters. Soldiers started getting sick from drinking bad water, morale was dropping, and then came the terror tactics. Vlad would send small groups of fighters to attack the Ottoman camp at night, slitting throats, setting fires, and disappearing into the darkness. The Ottomans couldn't sleep, they couldn't relax. They were in enemy territory, surrounded by nothing, and they knew that somewhere out there, Vlad was watching. And then came the night that would go down in history. On the night of June 16, 1462, Vlad launched what's known as the night attack. This is the stuff of legend, and it nearly worked. Vlad had received intelligence about the location of Mehmed's camp. The Ottoman army was massive, but they were exhausted, spread out, and vulnerable. So Vlad gathered a force of somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, his best cavalry, and he decided to do the unthinkable. He was going to attack the Ottoman camp directly, at night, with the goal of killing Mehmed himself. If he could assassinate the Sultan, the entire invasion would collapse. It was a desperate, insane, one-in-a-million plan, and it almost worked. Under the cover of darkness, Vlad and his men rode hard toward the Ottoman camp. They wore Ottoman clothing and used Ottoman passwords that Vlad had learned from captured prisoners. They snuck past the outer guards, and then all hell broke loose. Vlad's cavalry charged into the camp, slashing, stabbing, and burning everything in sight. The Ottomans were caught completely off guard. Tents were on fire, soldiers were running in every direction, and in the chaos no one knew who was attacking or where they were coming from. Vlad's men were screaming, trying to find Mehmed's tent, cutting down anyone in their path. For a few terrifying moments, it looked like Vlad might actually pull it off. The Ottoman camp was in total disarray, but Mehmed, to his credit, kept his cool. He rallied his personal guard, the Janissaries, and they formed a defensive line. Vlad's men fought like demons, but they were outnumbered and eventually had to retreat before the entire Ottoman army could regroup and surround them. Vlad had failed to kill Mehmed, but the psychological damage was done. The most powerful man in the world had been attacked in his own camp and had barely escaped. The Ottomans were shaken, but Vlad had one more card to play, one more horror to unleash. As the Ottoman army continued its march deeper into Wallachia, they approached the capital city of Targovist. And that's when they saw it. The forest of the Impaled. Just outside the city, stretched across a massive field, were thousands and thousands of stakes, and on every single one was a body, Ottoman prisoners of war, soldiers, officials, and even women and children. Some had been dead for days, rotting in the sun. Others were still alive, writhing in agony. The stakes were arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, almost like a grotesque garden. At the center, on the tallest stake, was Hamza Pasha, one of Mehmed's most trusted generals, dressed in his finest clothes. Vlad had made sure he was impaled carefully, so he'd suffer longer. The smell was indescribable. Flies and vultures swarmed everywhere, and Vlad wanted Mehmed to see it. He wanted the Sultan to walk through this forest of death and understand that this was what happened to anyone who invaded Wallachia. And it worked. According to historical accounts, Mehmed was absolutely horrified. Even hardened Janissaries, soldiers who had seen countless battles, were vomiting and turning away. Some sources say that Mehmed himself turned pale and had to leave the area immediately. This wasn't just a battlefield. This was a monument to terror, a message written in blood and suffering. The Ottomans had faced many enemies before, but they'd never faced anyone like Vlad. He wasn't just trying to win a war, he was trying to break them psychologically, to make them fear him more than death itself. Now, here's the thing. The Ottoman invasion did continue, but the momentum was gone. Mehmed pushed forward to Targoviste, but Vlad had already abandoned the city. There was nothing there. No supplies, no people, just empty buildings. The Ottoman army was exhausted, demoralized, and running low on supplies. Disease was spreading through their ranks, probably dysentery or typhus from the poisoned water and lack of sanitation. Soldiers were deserting. And Mehmed, despite having a massive army, realized he couldn't win this war. Not because Vlad was stronger, but because Wallachia had become a nightmare. Every step forward was a step into hell. So after a few more weeks of fruitless campaigning, Mehmed made the decision to withdraw. He left behind his younger brother Radu, who also happened to be Vlad's younger brother, with a smaller force to continue the fight. Yeah, family drama on top of everything else. Radu had converted to Islam during his captivity as a child and had become an Ottoman favorite. The Ottomans installed Radu as a rival claimant to the Wallachian throne, hoping to turn the nobility against Vlad, and eventually it worked. The Wallachian nobles, exhausted by the constant warfare and terrified of further Ottoman reprisals, turned on Vlad. In 1462, after the Ottoman withdrawal, Vlad's support crumbled. He was forced to flee to Hungary, hoping to find protection from King Matthias Corvinus, who had promised support against the Ottomans. But in a cruel twist of fate, Matthias had Vlad arrested on trumped-up charges, probably because he'd made peace with the Ottomans and didn't want to harbor a fugitive. Vlad spent the next 12 years imprisoned in Hungary. Can you imagine? The man who defied the Ottoman Empire, who created nightmares that would last generations, locked in a cell for over a decade. But the story doesn't end there. In 1476, Vlad was released and actually reclaimed the throne of Wallachia for a third time, but his reign didn't last long. Just a few months later, he was killed in battle against the Ottomans. The exact details of his death are unclear. Some sources say he was assassinated by his own men, some say he died fighting, and some say he was ambushed. His body was supposedly decapitated, and his head sent to Constantinople as a trophy for the new sultan. They say it was displayed on a stake, a final cruel irony for the man who had impaled so many. So what's the legacy of Vlad the Impaler? Well, in Romania, he's actually remembered as a hero, a defender of Christianity and national independence, who stood up to impossible odds. In the West, he became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, though Stoker took a lot of creative liberties. The real Vlad wasn't a vampire, but in some ways, what he actually did was more terrifying than any work of fiction. He understood something fundamental about power and fear. He knew that if you can't defeat your enemy with strength, you defeat them with terror. You make them so afraid that they'd rather turn back than face you. The Ottoman Empire went on to conquer much of Eastern Europe in the following decades, but they never forgot Wallachia. They never forgot the forest of the Impaled, and neither did anyone else. Stories of Vlad spread across Europe, growing more horrifying with each retelling. Some said he drank the blood of his victims, that he dipped bread in their blood and ate it while they died, that he took pleasure in their screams. Were these stories true? We'll never know for certain, but what we do know is that Vlad used impalement more than any other ruler in history. It was his signature, his calling card, his way of saying, "I am not to be trifled with." Impalement, by the way, is one of the most horrific forms of execution ever devised. The victim is placed on a sharpened stake that's carefully inserted to avoid vital organs, so they die slowly over hours or end days. It's deliberate, prolonged torture, and Vlad perfected it. What's fascinating is how this one man, ruling a tiny kingdom with limited resources, managed to terrify the most powerful empire in the world. The Ottoman Empire had conquered sophisticated kingdoms, defeated massive armies, and brought down ancient dynasties. But Vlad? He didn't have grand armies or advanced weapons. What he had was an absolute willingness to go further than anyone else. He had no limits, no moral boundaries, no line he wouldn't cross, and that made him more dangerous than any conventional enemy. You can negotiate with a rational enemy. You can predict their moves, anticipate their strategy. But how do you fight someone who's willing to turn an entire forest into a graveyard? How do you conquer a land where every step forward takes you deeper into a waking nightmare? You can't. At least, not easily. And that's really the lesson of Vlad the Impaler. It's not about glorifying violence or brutality, because what he did was absolutely monstrous. But it's about understanding how fear can be a weapon, just as powerful as any sword or cannon. Mehmed II had conquered Constantinople with superior technology and tactics. Vlad defended Wallachia with pure psychological warfare. One created an empire, the other created a legend. And centuries later, we're still talking about that forest of stakes, still imagining the horror those Ottoman soldiers must have felt when they first laid eyes on it. So yeah, Vlad the Impaler, a hero to some, a monster to others, and a nightmare to the Ottoman Empire. His methods were barbaric, his tactics were cruel, and his legacy is complicated. But there's no denying that he's one of the most fascinating and terrifying figures in medieval history. He proved that sometimes the scariest enemy isn't the biggest or the strongest. It's the one who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's darkest moments, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories from the past. Trust me, history is way more brutal and way more interesting than anything Hollywood could come up with. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.